All right, so we talked earlier about life being organized and talked about the importance of the cell. The organization of life can be even more formalized than what we briefly talked about earlier, into something called the hierarchy of life. And this is just a way to, again, list the building blocks of living things in order from lowest to biggest here. And so at the most fundamental level, everything, not just living things, are made of atoms. And hopefully you've heard of atoms a little bit. We'll talk about them more in the next chapter. But atoms are the fundamental unit of everything that is. Fundamental unit of rocks, fundamental unit of us. Includes things like hydrogen, oxygen, magnesium, calcium, things you've probably heard of. Atoms can combine to build things that are larger, and these are called molecules. So for example, and I'm going to move over here and write, oops, or not, okay. So molecules, like H2O is a molecule, so it's made of hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms combined. And even larger molecules, these are called macromolecules. Macro means very large. Things that, again, you've probably heard of: proteins, fats, sugars, starch. These are all examples of macromolecules. They're very large molecules built of hundreds and thousands of atoms. Those molecules and macromolecules can combine and form cells. So, and if we follow along with the figure in your that comes from your text, we've got atoms building into molecules and macromolecules, and then those combine to form cells, and in this case it's showing muscle cells. So all these different kinds of macromolecules will combine into cells. Cells can then form tissues. In this case, many cells, many muscle cells are forming muscle tissue. Many tissues can form an organ. So this is a heart, and in the heart you have muscle tissue, you also have nervous tissue, you have connective tissue, all that come together to form a complex organ. Many organs can come together and form a complex organism. So again, you have a heart, you have a stomach, you have lungs. These all have to coordinate and work together to build an organism. A group of an organism, so a group of parrots in this figure, forms a population. So a population is an interbreeding group of the same organism. So notice I said interbreeding. That means they've got to live close enough together to mate. So a prairie dog colony in Denver is not necessarily the same population as a prairie dog colony in Greeley, because they live too far away to mate with each other, so they're not the same population. So that's really important for some aspects of biology. A community is about the organisms within an area that interact with each other, the populations of organisms. So not just the parrot, but the tree the parrot lives in, any predators of the parrot, basically any other populations of organisms that are interacting with this population. So the community is all of the living things within an area: plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, everything. The ecosystem gets a little more complicated because you add in the things that are not alive. So this is kind of interesting. So it's the community plus all the things that make up that environment. So things like a river. A river is not alive, but a river is really important for an ecosystem. How much rain falls is part of an ecosystem. How much rocks are in the soil. These all contribute to what that ecosystem is like. The weather patterns, monsoon patterns, storm patterns, all are important in the ecosystem but are not living. And then the top and final level of life, at least so far, because we haven't found life anywhere else in the universe, is the biosphere. And the biosphere is basically anywhere in life that living things can be found. So here's a question for you, like how this might appear on an exam, how this kind of information would appear on an exam. Put the following levels of biological organization into the correct order, going from least to most complex. So I'll give you a minute to do that. And so this one was pretty easy because, of course, you had the list right here, and it's exactly like this. And I just want to take this opportunity to remind you that you do also have your chapter outline handout that you can print from D2L, and you'll see that there's another practice problem like this that's a little bit harder, and I encourage you to do that one as well. Okay, last thing for this lecture video is just like, okay, this hierarchy of life is kind of silly. How does it really get used? Why would a biologist really use this? Because it just kind of seems, whatever. And so, why would this hierarchy really matter? Well, it's more of a frame of mind rather than a formal thing that a biologist would use. And so the example here, or example question is kind of thinking about how would a toxic chemical affect the hierarchy of living things, and that's the approach that you would take in trying to understand what might happen if there was an environmental contaminant. And so, an example that many people have heard of is a chemical called DDT, which used to be used as a pesticide. And so it was a chemical, a molecule made out of atoms. And they understood the chemistry of it really well, so they understood it at the atom and molecule level. And the people who developed it understood it even to the cellular level. They knew that they were going to spray it, and it was going to get into these insects when they sprayed it, and that would kill the insects. And that's kind of where the thought process stopped for the people who were selling and making DDT. And nobody really realized that DDT was really going to be a lot bigger of a problem than that. And to understand what that DDT did, we can think about the hierarchy of living things. And so what happened with DDT is it had this effect on the cells of the insects, and the insects were dying, and birds would eat those insects. And the DDT didn't kill the birds directly, but in smaller birds who were eating the insects, they would eat so many of the insects that the DDT would start to collect in their tissues. And again, for those birds, it wasn't killing them, but it was depositing into their tissues and organs. And what happened is that other birds would then eat those birds. And so this was really important for predator birds like eagles and hawks. They would eat those little birds who had all this buildup of DDT in their tissues, and then they would get exposed to it as well. And what happened was it turned out that DDT that they were then getting was causing them to have weak shells. And because they had weak shells, they had less babies. And so the population of this organism, like beyond the individual, right? The individual was okay, but because they couldn't reproduce that much, the population of the organism started to get lower. And this was really bad, in particular for the American eagle. The American eagle was on the verge of extinction by the 1970s, and this is this iconic bird in the United States. It's our national bird. It's, and a lot of images about our country and a lot of our patriotic stuff. And so people were like kind of upset the American eagle, that this was happening with the American eagle. And so, but if you sort of continue with the hierarchy of life, like the population of American eagles started to get smaller, and you start to think about the other organisms that were interacting with the eagle. Now the eagles weren't eating the rodents that they should be eating. They weren't creating they weren't interacting in that community. The ecosystem was damaged. If there's too many rodents, they eat too much of the plant matter, they eat too much of the bugs. So can be all of these sort of domino effects from something like that. And you can only really understand them if you have this mentality of thinking about the hierarchy of life, is to either to understand what went wrong with something like DDT, or hopefully be able to think about something like that before it becomes a problem. And just to sort of give you a happier end to this story, DDT was eventually banned in the United States, and unsurprisingly, American eagle populations rebounded, and so American bald eagle populations, while not back to what they once were, are not particularly endangered anymore compared to a lot of other species. And in fact, amazingly enough, you can see bald eagles in Aurora in the wintertime especially, and even in the summertime sometimes. And there's actually even nesting eagles near us too. So that's kind of a happy story. And again, the hierarchy of life is about a way to understand impacts on our ecosystem, or impacts up the chain of living things. All right, so we'll stop here today.